friends, today we're going to be reading Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dohl. This is a great book. It has a movie that goes with it too. Chapter 1. Here Comes Charlie. These two very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. This is Charlie. How do you know? And how do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is very pleased to meet you. The whole family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket lived together in a small wooden house at the very edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 old grandparents because they were so tired and old. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa George and Grandpa Josephine on one side, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Georgina on the other side. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie slept in the other room upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, this wasn't too bad, but in the winter, freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a better house, or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed little caps onto the tops of tubes of toothpaste. After the tubes had been filled, but a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough money to buy 1/2 of the things that this large family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford was bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays was a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays, because then, although they had exactly the same thing, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 grandfathers, the 2 grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went all morning till night with a horribly empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all. And although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass. His mouth watered like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking creamy candy bars out of their pockets and munching them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Once a year on his birthday, Charlie Bucket got a taste of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for this special occasion, and when the day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it on that marvelous birthday morning, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days, he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. And then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper, exposing just a single corner of the chocolate bar, and he would take a tiny little nibble, just enough to allow this lovely sweet taste to spread slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take just another tiny nibble, and so on and so on. And this way, Charlie would make his 10-cent bar of chocolate last for more than a month. But I haven't told you yet the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate more than anything else. This thing for him was far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching creamy candy bars right in front of him. This was the most terrible, torturing thing you can imagine. And it was in the town itself. Actually, within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and most famous in the whole world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man named Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that had ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and high walls surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around and in every direction, the air was scented with the heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose up in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell around him. And oh, how he loved the smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. Chapter 1.